Hello everyone, we are back here at the University of Southern California. I am Laurent Bouzereau, co-producer with Universal Studios Home Video of this exciting celebration of the Back to the Future trilogy on DVD. We are here at USC Film School with the two Bobs, Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis. And we're going to be asking them questions. The audience will be participating, and I will be repeating their questions. So all of you viewers at home will be able to experience this commentary as if you had been right here with us. So we should start by talking about the sequel. How did the sequel come about, and how it was like almost 4 years after the first movie? So tell us how that all started, and then we'll start taking questions from all of you guys. Bob Gale?
Well, the first movie, of course, made so much money that it went from being a movie to a corporate entity, a corporate asset. And so the success of it meant that there was no way that Universal wasn't going to want to make a sequel. So the first thing that they did was, smartly, they asked us if we would do it. And we said, well, yeah, we'll do it on the condition that we have Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd come back, because despite what some people thought about the end of the first movie, we didn't have any idea for doing a sequel. The end of the first movie was simply a joke. We, as we'll tell you, we found we kind of painted ourselves into a corner with that ending. But what happened was we decided that as long as we had Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, we would be able to concoct a story that made sense and would be a suitable sequel to Back to the Future. So Sid Sheinberg went and made a deal with both Michael and Chris, and thinking ahead, Sid made a deal not only for a Back to the Future 2, but for a Back to the Future 3, although Back to the Future 3 wasn't in anybody's consciousness at that time. And then Bob and I decided that, okay, what is it that people go to see a sequel? What is it that they want to see? And they want to see as many characters come back from the first movie as possible. So the next thing we did was we contacted the rest of the cast to find out who else wanted to be in the sequel. And first we called Leah Thompson, and she said, hey, if you guys are doing it, I'm in. And we called up Tom Wilson, and he said the same thing. And then we contacted Crispin Glover. And that was a little different. Crispin asked for some things that were pretty ridiculous for an actor in his position in the industry. He basically wanted to have the exact same deal as Michael J. Fox, and even asked for some things that Michael wasn't getting. And I had this phone conversation with his agent. I said, this is just completely ridiculous. I said, go back to your client and talk to him, and if I don't hear from you in 2 weeks, we're just going to assume that we will not have Crispin Glover in the sequel. So the whole idea in Back to the Future Part 2 that George McFly is a tombstone was a direct result of Crispin deciding that he didn't want to be in the sequel.
Tell us a little bit about the screenwriting process, because you had different ideas as to where you guys were going to go with it, including the 60s, I think, at some point. So tell us about the writing process of the script, and at one point did it become, I think, part 2 and 3. Bob Zemeckis.
I've said many times before that it's really hard to do sequels. You know, they're really hard to do. And it's mainly because I found, you know, because once we decided we were gonna do this, studying what sequels work are basically the ones like The Godfather Part 2, which is a continuation of the movie. That is so rare, because most sequels are like James Bond movies or Indiana Jones movies, where there's basically stories that have characters that don't have dramatic character arcs. They're secret agents, or they're adventurers, and they just keep changing the adventure. So the character can stay the same, and all you do is change the villains and change the settings. And those make the most successful sequels. So we were stuck because we actually had a movie that had character development in it, even though it had all this time travel and science fiction stuff in it as well. What I realized is that audiences thought of sequels the same way they think of sitcoms on television. They just want to be back having another adventure with these characters. And so the audiences have this sort of love-hate relationship with sequels. They want them to be different, but not too different. They want them to be the same, but not exactly the same. So you're constantly on this balance beam trying to figure out what to write. And then the biggest problem as well is that everybody has an opinion about what the sequel should be. I mean, everybody who saw the first movie starts writing their own sequel. So the thing that made the movie an experience for me as a director was this breakthrough idea that Bob and I had, where it wasn't so much just going to different times, like we're not going to go to the future, we're not going to go to like in the original draft that Bob wrote, it was the 60s, we're not going to go to the Wild West. The idea was to go into the original movie, and we had the unique circumstances of a time travel movie that actually addressed time travel paradox issues, and we were making a sequel. So we had a chance to do that, and that's what excited me more than anything about making the sequel to this movie.
When we started trying to figure out what exactly the sequel was going to be, again, we were stuck with the ending of the first movie, and it just seemed that there was no way that we couldn't start the second movie the way the first one ended. But we had a real serious writing problem, because the whole point of the first movie was that you can change history. The future isn't written, nothing is written, you can change things. So we're starting the second movie with this idea that something's got to be done about your kids. And we said, well, gee, could Doc just hand Marty a big box of condoms and say, this will solve the problem here? Marty says, I'm not going to marry you, Jennifer. The problem is solved. How were we going to get the audience to be interested in the children of Marty and Jennifer when we don't even really know anything about Jennifer, because she was such a minor character in the first movie, and their kids don't even exist. And we've said that they don't necessarily have to exist. So what we finally decided to do was to just use that as an excuse to get into what became the real essence of the movie, which was the story of the misuse of time travel and going into the future to get this sports almanac, and then, which of course ends up wreaking all kinds of havoc in the past.
I also had a real problem. It was really, I was doing something that I swore I would never do, which is do a movie that depicts the future. Because I personally don't like to see movies that predict the future. The only guy whose movies I've ever enjoyed who's done the future has been, Stanley Kubrick. And he didn't even think of a PC, when he did Clockwork Orange. I mean, see, the problem is you underestimate the future. You
underestimate it on things and you overestimate it on other things.
So the way that, we knew we had to do at least a section of the movie in the future, just so we could get out of the future and get back onto safer territory. So the way we wrote ourselves around that was just to write as many jokes as we could think of, as we thought, let's just make the future funny. That was the best way that we could deal with that naughty problem, because obviously when we get to the year 2015, which is right around the corner, it's not going to look like our movie at all, and that means our movie is going to be this kind of quaint thing, I might actually have to live to see that happen,
But we got out of it because...
As long as I keep my cholesterol down.
We had Doc Brown saying that the future is just the extrapolation of what happens if things continue today. So since we changed them, we have a very convenient excuse.
And I don't know if we talked about this. Did we talk about what we wanted to do with the first movie about changing the future? That was one of the very early ideas. Was we had this idea of what if somebody went to the 1950s, altered time, came back to the 1980s, but the 1980s in the altered time looks like what futurists thought it was going to look like in the 1950s, if that makes any sense. In other words, if you went back to, say you went back to 1950 with fusion technology, 1980 would be a completely different world. anyway, we ended up throwing that idea out because the idea about the characters and the idea about story and not dealing with that big idea ended up being a much better movie in Back to the Future 1.
Why didn't the idea of the 60s work in the
Well,
script?
it wasn't so much that it didn't work, it was that it wasn't particularly interesting.
Or funny.
It was,
Well, I mean, it was funny in a sad, awful way. You know? Like the clothes looked funny, you know, stuff like that.
but what had happened, what the 60s draft was, just so that you understand what was happening here, the first two acts were the same. The Future, 1985A, and it turned out that Biff gave himself the almanac not in 1955, but in 1967. So Marty goes back to 1967 to get the almanac instead of going back to 1955, and he ended up endangering his own conception instead of his parents' meeting. And Bob thought, we did that movie. It's not different enough from the first movie that makes it worthy of us spending a year of our life doing it. And Bob came up with this idea of let's go back into the first movie, and that was such a damn cool idea that we had to do it.
And you also got the bonus of being able to go to the movie and seeing the characters that you liked exactly the way they were in the first movie. Biff was the same. You could bring back. It broke our hearts that now we couldn't have Crispin in the movie because we could have really had some fun with him. But it turned out fine anyway.
Can you tell us if part of the process of writing Back to the Future Part 2 was to actually go back to watching Back to the Future Part 1 and see what elements you had in that story and how you could apply that to the sequels?
Oh yeah, we knew what these big pivotal moments were, and I think that where we knew we wanted to go was we knew that the time-changing moment, the pivotal moment in Part 1 is when George punches Biff and changes the course of his life. So we thought that's the place where Marty has to go and witness it because he sort of just got there in the first movie, right after Biff got knocked out, and he didn't get to see anything leading up to that. So we knew, okay, let's do that. Let's get him there to see that from the other side of the parking lot. And that was sort of the basic idea. And then we thought, well, then the thugs have, two Martys running around, and, so it turned out to be actually a lot of fun.
The notion of time travel was a lot more complex in Back to the Future Part 2 than it was in the original film. Can you tell us about the type of research you might have done to make that credible?
Well, I think Back to the Future Part 2 might be the most interesting movie I've ever made. And it got, like all sequels, it got a bunch of, negative reviews. But I think there's really a lot going on. It asks a lot of interesting questions. It's got a lot of dark stuff in it, a lot of edgy things in it. I guess the way to answer your question exactly is that by the time Bob and I got done making the first movie, we were time travel experts.
As a matter of fact, there is such a thing.
As a matter of fact, here's the greatest compliment we ever got. When I was doing Contact, the first thing when I met Carl Sagan, first thing he said to me is he said, "That movie you made is the best time travel, a movie based on the science of time travel that's ever been made." And I thought, well, what can you do? You can't ask for more than that. We violated quite a few rules of our own, what we didn't do in the first movie, like duplication and things like that, but that's what the fun of it was in the second movie.
For those that are really interested in all the permutations of the duplication paradox, I recommend a science fiction book called Up the Line by Robert Silverberg. Silverberg was probably the dean of intricate time travel stories, and that one has the most of the duplication paradox. And I read that when I was in college, and a lot of that stuff stuck with me, and it's in Part 2.
Didn't you do one, though? There's a book with all the mapping out of one of your companion books to the sequels. One of those Back to the Future companion books where all the timelines are.
Oh yeah, it's got
yeah.
Of
So
course
you can pick that up too.
We had we had it all over my office. All these
Right.
all these index cards with all these different numbers. In fact, the script actually had the most radical scene numbering system ever designed in a movie to keep track of all these different time periods. We would just jump up another 100 numbers in each time period we went so that people could look at the scene number and know what period we were in.
But I think that the other important story about writing the sequel was that in the first draft of the sequel, which was, I don't know what draft it was probably 12 or 15 drafts down the line, but the one that we said to the studio was the one that we wanted to make was the one that ended, the ending was actually part 3. And we brought it to the studio and we wanted to make this 3-hour giant epic that went from everything you saw in the 2 sequels, from the future to back into the first movie and then end up in the Wild West. And it was one of those great Sid Sheinberg moments because he was the one who, he'd been badgering us for years to make the sequel, and we presented him with the script and he said, I'm not going to make the most expensive movie in the history of the movie business.
What happened actually, let's backtrack a little bit. Because we had this version that had, I don't know, it was 160, 170 pages that had everything in it. And I kind of felt that it didn't really work the way it should because we were introducing all these brand new characters in what was ostensibly the 4th act of the movie, the Old West. Suddenly we've got to introduce Clara, we've got to introduce Buford, Marty's ancestors in the Old West. And it's really hard to introduce that many new characters in the last hour of the movie. So I said to Bob, let me take a pass at this and write it really long and see what happens. So I ended up with this 220-page script that was, it was Back to the Future 2 and Back to the Future 3 with everything in Back to the Future 3 flushed out the way it was supposed to be. You would, develop all the characters properly. And we realized that what we had here was 2 movies. So this is where we made this good news, bad news phone call to Sid Sheinberg in the studio. They'd wanted Back to the Future 2 out for summer 1989. And that wasn't going to happen because Bob had been working on Roger Rabbit, and that turned into a hell of a bigger production than anybody ever thought. So we kept pushing Back to the Future 2 because of that. So we called up the studio and we said, here's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is we're not going to have Back to the Future 2 for you for summer 1989. The good news is we will have Back to the Future 2 for you for Christmas 1989, and we'll have Back to the Future 3 for you in the summer of 1990. And Sheinberg thought we were completely insane. And he said, I don't want to hear anything about Back to the Future 3. Just give me goddamn Back to the Future 2. So, okay, that's when we took the 220-page script and condensed it down to 160 pages. And then Sheinberg had that one and threw it down and said, this is the most expensive movie ever made and I'm not making it.
Ironically, he was the man a couple years later who made Waterworld. That was the most expensive movie until the Titanic was made. So you see?
So when the budget came in for this version that included 4th act of Back to the Future 3, and it was so ridiculous, he said, I don't know what we're going to do. And I had, as a good producer, I'd done my homework, and I'd had my production manager do a budget based on the 220-page script, splitting it in half and saying, all right, instead of making one movie that's going to cost $65 million, let's do 2 movies that are going to cost $35 million each. So when Sheinberg got pissed off at us, that's when I was able to say, okay, take a look at this budget, Sid. Here's Back to the Future 2 and 3, and they each only cost $35 million. And he said, okay.
And I remember him saying this. He said, this is either the most insane idea or the most brilliant idea. That's what he said about, making the 2 movies at the same time.
Since Crispin Glover was not in Back to the Future Part 2, any challenges in writing the part of George McFly, Bob Gale?
Oh, yeah. We thought, at one time, I thought, well, we could go into the future and have George McFly be dead, but that wasn't, I didn't think that the audience would like to see that. They want to know that all these characters are alive. So we came up with this idea of hanging him upside down in this back brace, thinking two ways. One, if we don't have, well, three ways. One, it's funny. Two, if we don't have Crispin in it and we have another actor, we put him in makeup, he's going to be upside down and the audience is going to have a hard time recognizing him to tell whether he's Crispin or not. And three, if Crispin never changed his mind and decided he did want to do it, then we get to hang him upside down.
I mean, we thought, well, he could be, climbing Mount Everest, but then that would just be, then people would just be talking about him, and so this turned out to be the best idea.
Bob Zemeckis, in reference to film quotations and film references in the movies, we're just wondering if there was any intentions on your part to refer to Pottersville and It's a Wonderful Life in Back to the Future Part 2.
Capra movies are in our mind no matter what we write. All the Back to the Future movies are like a Frank Capra movie in a lot of ways. A lot of people don't realize that, but It's a Wonderful Life is a spectacular time travel movie, and so is A Christmas Carol. Those are two great time travel stories. But yeah, as a matter of fact, we were worried that we would get hammered by making it too close of a Pottersville, but that's what that section of the movie needed to have.
If the movie is a success, it's an homage. If it's a failure, it's a ripoff.
Right, exactly.
There's a rumor that Marty McFly was going to go back into the prehistorical time. Did you guys ever write that into the scripts?
Never.
Can you comment about Michael J. Fox being called Chicken throughout the movie?
We just introduced that into the sequel. We realized that in the first movie, the character who makes a change is George McFly. We needed to have Marty go through a change in the course of the sequels. And so we gave him this character flaw that he overreacts anytime anybody calls him a chicken, so that through the course of his adventure, he would learn that that wasn't a very good lifestyle choice.
Yeah, it was more like we thought, Marty was this guy who sort of had the world, in the palm of his hand in the first movie. He had, he was charming, he was funny, he was good looking, had all this stuff going for him. And so we thought, wouldn't it be interesting if his dream of what his future was completely opposite of what he thought it would be, and then why would it get that way? So we sort of just designed all this stuff in to give him, make him this kind of broken down middle-aged guy in the future.
Why does the old Biff die?
Well, that's a good question. Why does the old Biff die when he comes back? There's two reasons for that. The reason that you can accept watching this movie exactly the way it is that the shock of time travel probably caused him to have a seizure. But the original concept was that Biff came back to a world where old Biff didn't exist anymore. And in fact, in the deleted scenes on the DVD, you'll see the extension of Biff's seizure where he actually is erased from existence. And Bob and I kind of postulated that somewhere around the mid-1990s, Lorraine got pissed off at him and shot him. So old Biff would have returned to 2015 and he would have been long gone and buried and therefore have been erased from existence.
Bob and I understood that, but when we actually previewed the movie with Biff fading out of existence, and the audience,
we lost the audience completely.
They just couldn't go there, and we realized that
it's an idea that only makes sense the second time you see the movie.
Right.
And that's why the audience couldn't get it, because they had no idea what this middle section was of this perverted 1985. So we just decided, let's just take it out and not risk losing the audience at that point in the movie.
Then the story that Bob just described, you could do a whole movie about that. That's like a lot of stuff.
After you completed the trilogy, was there ever any talks about doing a Back to the Future Part 4?
Three is a dramatic number. It's a very important number. The trilogy, the Trinity. I think 3 is probably a good place to stop. 4 starts to become too balanced.
You said earlier that you backed yourself into a corner when you ended the movie Part 1 and decided to do a sequel. How would you have ended Part 1 if you had known you were going to do a sequel?
We would have just been able to do anything we wanted to do if we didn't put the girl in the car. I mean, we had to deal
And
with
that's
that.
the first thing that happens is Doc puts her to sleep. I mean,
Yeah, he's got to knock her out. We had to get her out of the picture.
She spends the whole movie being carried around, being unconscious.
Right.
But as far as what would have happened if we didn't have that ending, I mean, it's like, well, what movie would you have had if we had Crispin Glover? We don't know. These were the facts that we had, so we dealt with the universe that existed and not with. We can't answer what would have happened if we had a different universe to start with.
If the girl wasn't there, Marty could have gotten in the car with the Doc, and Marty could have said, "Doc, this is so great. We're going to the future." "No, we're not. We're going to the prehistoric times, back to ancient Rome." We could have done anything, because we had that kind of joke at the end. That we wrote that joke about, no, there's no problem with you. It's your kids. We really never thought of it being a setup for a sequel ever. We thought,
and we still had to change it. If you look at the redo of that scene in the beginning of part 2. When Marty says, "What happens to us in the future? Do we become assholes?" We have this extra little moment where Chris Lloyd just kind of, he stutters and does that little look to indicate, well, yeah, you do become an asshole, but I can't tell you.
How much did you guys think about, this is like 4 years later, ILM has gone much further, you just did Roger Rabbit. How much did you think about all the cool stuff you could do in the future, such as the use of this new camera, I think it's called the Vista Glide, that allowed you to film several actors playing the same roles and all that stuff?
when I was doing Roger Rabbit, they had just built this new big VistaFlex camera for me, the silent camera, and they did a great job. I mean, it showed up and it worked the first day that it got there, and I knew we were going to do this thing in the future, and Bob was working on it, and I was in London making Roger Rabbit, and I knew we were doing this thing where Marty was going to be Marty from the movie, and he was going to see himself as his kid.
And as his older self.
And as his older self.
And then I called up Bob and I said, well, Michael J. Fox is also going to play his daughter.
Right. So you got to remember, this is the very first digital shot I ever did is in Back to the Future 2. It's one of the shots where Marty's on the skateboard in the cave, and what we did is we put a rod out on the back of a camera car, and we held him with these wires, and they did the first computer removing of that rod on that shot. So this is pre any digital images. So knowing we're going to do this movie with all this stuff in there, and this is one of the good things about doing a sequel, is you can do stuff like this. I said, build me a motion control camera. You know, I just said that. I just said, Ireland, I said, I need a camera that we can do these splits in that can pan, tilt, and dolly. And they said, okay. And I said, and you guys got 2 years to build it. And they built this thing called the Vista Glide camera. And it
worked on the first day.
It worked on the first day.
They didn't know it was going to work on the first day, but it did.
It was very complicated, but it worked.
Didn't you guys have an earthquake or something that was...
Yeah, that when we were doing, remember we were doing the pizza shot, with the shot that starts with the three hands coming to take the pieces of pizza, and it pulls back and you see three Michael J. Foxes in the same shot. And that shot took us 2 or 3 days to do because it was so complicated, and it's cut real short in the movie. It was originally like a 90-second shot. It's played all in a master. And we had to lock everything down every time we stopped. We would do it. We filmed it on that one. I think the A side was with Marty as Marlene, and we had Marlene and Lorraine in the shot, and we did it with stand-ins for everybody else. Then everything would be locked down, so you couldn't move the table, you couldn't move a picture on the wall, you couldn't move a light, you couldn't move anything. We waited for Michael J. Fox to get into his next makeup, played back the program on the camera that made the camera move exactly the way the selected take was on the A side, and then we had to lock everything down again. Well, we were worried that what would happen if we had an earthquake before we got to do the next part of the shot, and it actually happened. We had an earth tremor one night, but it wasn't powerful enough to have knocked anything out of alignment. But Ken Ralston damn near had a heart attack when he heard that there had been an earth tremor that night.
Every little thing, every little piece of set dressing would have to be hot glued into the set, like so that nothing could move or vibrate or shift. And the way we would have to do those scenes is that the computer and the camera was locked to the video playback of the first side of the shot. And then on another track, I would give verbal cues. We would rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. And I would mark the track on the computerized dolly with a piece of tape and put numbers on them. And I wouldn't even watch the scene. So I would see it was coming up on the red tape, and I'd go, and turn, and now, and pizza. And so when playing back in the set, when they were doing the B and the C sides of those shots, they had the actor had the voice of his first A side performance, my cues that were based on the burn-in on the camera move, and then he had to act the new character that he was doing. And basically what we did is we would put a stand-in or another actor in there for him to work with. Those days are long gone, but
Thank goodness.
thank God they're gone. But that's how you had to do it in the old optical days.
One of the other things that we learned from trying to figure out how do you use this camera and use this technique the right way, first thing you do when you get a new toy is you want to show it off. But that wasn't necessarily a good idea. As we learned in that particular shot, the 90-second long take of the pizza scene all in one master, it just didn't play right. It just didn't seem, you didn't know what to watch, you didn't know what to follow. And it was one of our editors who I think said, if you had three different actors playing this, you'd never play this whole scene in a master. And that's when we realized, you gotta approach this like, even though they're all Michael J. Fox, or you've got two Chris Lloyds or whatever you've got to make the movie as if these were different actors, and that's how the audience will buy the illusion that it's working, because the filmmaking is the same that you would do as if you had two different actors.
But then it's great in the scene with the two Biffs in the garage, and then there's that part where he hands the book to himself, and when we were previewing that movie, somebody cried out in the audience, "How did they do that?" And I just sat there and I thought, okay, mission accomplished, because it was a simple thing, but unbelievably spectacular. And basically what it was in addition to all the servos on the camera and the dolly, we had them build an armature in the dashboard of the car with another servo that was hooked to the computer with the book attached to it, and it went zzz, and it moved that book through the frame exactly where the split was, even though the camera was pushing in, or I think it was panning or something. I don't remember what
Yeah,
it was.
panning.
It was panning.
Right.
So the book was actually slave to the move in the camera computer.
The other shot to watch, which is the most perfect illusion in the movie, is the scene when Marty, in the Cafe 80s, Marty takes the hat off of Marty Jr. and puts it on his own head. There's one frame there where the arm and the hat are out of frame. It worked on one frame, and it's absolutely seamless.
You could do Back to the Future 2 now, and it would be like a shrug. Anybody could do this. I mean, anybody. All you need is a computer. None of the, but those old optical days, it was a computer. That's what created the motion control camera. But now with digital images, it'd be real easy.
One question here has to do with Michael J. Fox playing so many different characters in the movie Back to the Future Part 2. Is there any reason why you decided to use him so many times, playing so many different characters? Bob Gale?
Yeah, we had Michael play all those different parts because it was funny.
And he was a good actor, and it was, why not? He only does Marlene in 2 shots.
The music in all 3 Back to the Future movies is really quite remarkable. Can you describe your relationship in coming up with the themes with composer Alan Silvestri?
Well, in the sequels, Al just had he took the original themes from Part 1 and just wailed. He just did different variations on those ideas all throughout. As a matter of fact, I have to say, one of the saddest things of making Back to the Future 2 is that it's the only movie that I never had a chance to go to a single scoring session, because I was shooting Back to the Future 3, and we had these up in Sonora, California, where we were shooting Back to the Future 3. We had these trailer unit things that we dropped on this vacant lot, and that's where the editorial was. They tricked one out with all this high-tech, THX surround sound, and Al would just come up on the weekends and run run the cues for me, and I never had a chance to actually be on the stage. So, it was all done sort of long distance.
Bob Zemeckis, you mentioned the challenges of scoring Back to the Future Part 2 and 3 at once. Any other challenges involved with making two movies at once?
Yeah, well, you shouldn't do two movies at once. And I don't ever want to do it again. Now, I just did two movies back to back, which is different. That you can do. But doing two movies at the same time is not good for the following reason, is that you don't have enough time. You can't edit the movie you just finished while you're shooting. You don't have enough energy and enough time in your day. So the overlap of the two movies was during the post-production time of Back to the Future 2. And I look at the movie now and I know that if I wasn't in the middle of shooting a movie every single day, see a place where I could have really just tightened this movie up, I maybe would have made a few more, calmer decisions and pulled the movie together maybe a little bit better than I did. So I wouldn't recommend it. It's too hard. That was the hardest part.
The logistics of it was that Bob would be shooting Back to the Future 3 up in Sonora, and I went down to LA to supervise the dub of Back to the Future 2. So Bob would finish shooting. We were shooting days, so we'd lose the light around 5 or 5:30. He'd jump on a private plane, fly down to Burbank. There'd be a car waiting for him, take him over to the Hitchcock stage at Universal. We had dinner waiting for him. We'd eat. We'd sit down and play back the reels that we mixed that day. Bob would make his changes. We'd do them right there. We'd work till 10, 11, 12. Bob would go to the Sheraton Universal, check into a hotel room, go to sleep for 5 hours, wake up at 5. Car would take him back to the Burbank airport. He'd fly back to Sonora, and at 6 or 6:30 he'd be on the set directing Back to the Future 3. That went on for 2 or 3 weeks. As he said, it wasn't pretty.
When Back to the Future Part 2 was released, it got some reviews mentioned that it was a little bit confusing in terms of the time travel elements to the story. Do you recall that when you were writing the script and submitting it to the studio, that you ever got any notes back from the studio saying that the story was a little bit dense or a little confusing?
Well, I don't remember getting any notes from the
studio about it being too confusing. No, they were just so happy that we were making the movie. I don't know whether it was that they didn't care or whether they didn't have any problem with it.
Two different things are going on, and that's why, sequels, as proud as we are of making this movie, of these two movies, sequels are not movies. They're a whole different kind of thing. They're a marketing thing. Here's the thing about sequels. It's the only thing that's a sure thing in the entire movie business, and that is you can open a sequel to a successful movie. Studios love that because it's the only thing that they know, and they don't know anything else. So the only thing that they know is that we can open Back to the Future 2. There was not any other movie that opened on that weekend.
It was Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving 1989.
And we broke all records that weekend, and all this stuff happened. Those really small numbers nowadays, but and all the tracking was telling them that. But I know in my heart that this movie didn't pack the emotional wallop of the first movie.
It couldn't,
and the audiences were going to be let down. But that's, unfortunately, that's the nature of this business. I mean, sequels are unrealistic expectations. They're unrealistic expectations. Everybody goes to a sequel thinking they're going to see something. They don't know what it is, but it can never
give you the rush of the first one.
Yeah, live up to the expectations that you bring to the theater on that opening day.
You mentioned earlier the VistaGlide camera and the special effects that you did on Back to the Future Part 2. Was there ever anything that you had to rewrite or rethink because of the limitations of special effects back at the time that you were doing this movie?
Well, CGI technology didn't exist, so we didn't know what we were missing. So we were working with what we had
and what we knew.
I
would say the answer to that is no. We would always tell ILM, we want to do this, and can you figure this out? And we also had somebody who, in my opinion, is one of the greatest mechanical effects supervisors in the world on this show, Michael Lantieri, and he took it on himself as a personal challenge to try to figure out ways to do things on the set that today you would do with a computer. The movie's better for it. One of the best shots, by the way, when you watch the movie again, is when the DeLorean comes back to 1985A from the future, and it flies down from the sky, and it goes behind a lamppost and lands on the street, pulls into the driveway, and the dog gets out of the car all in one shot. The split, of course, was the lamppost. When the camera, when the VistaGlide panned across the lamppost, we went from a miniature model car flying at ILM in a blue screen, and they matched actual DeLorean driving down the street and into that driveway. Absolutely perfect, seamless shot. Bob told Ken that's what he wanted to do, and Ken said, "I'll figure out how to make it work," and he did.
In terms of the set design, actually, if you could talk a little bit about switching team, in a sense, from Larry Paul from part 1 to the Rick Carter team on part 2 and 3, and how he made that kind of seamless.
I had a chance to work with Rick Carter on an Amazing Stories episode, and I got along with him great, and I thought he was really creative, and he got the ideas and the tone of what it was that we were trying to do. You know, I don't think it was a problem for Rick to just step into the first movie and be able to like recreate that and see what we did. Although what's interesting is that the biggest challenge that we had was the construction of the town square into the production schedule, because we had to build this elaborate future town square with a lake and everything in it, and everything being futurized. And then we had to build the alternate, with the 1985A, the alternate, Sin City town square. And then we threw in the total perfect recreation of the first movie. So the only way, if you look at the movie really carefully, the only way that we could do that, Rick and I decided that the only way we could do it is we could only shoot one street of 1955 in the town.
Yeah, when that was the first stuff that we shot in Back to the Future 2, and if you had walked onto the set, you would have seen 1985A on the other streets that was going on at the same time.
It was the future, wasn't it?
No, I think we did 85A next, and then we just got off of there.
That's right, because it was like, that's right, because they built it into the casino. So basically, where the camera track was to do the stuff on the street in 1955, everything behind the camera was under construction. Right. in that town square. So I had to shoot that street out, get on the stage, give them the town square to finish it off, and then I don't even remember what we did when we came back to do the future. I don't even remember.
Well, we spent weeks doing all that stuff in the McFly townhouse.
Right.
That took forever to shoot that stuff, and they were building the future at that point. And then we also recreated the stage, the Johnny B. Good stage on stage 12. Originally in the first movie, and actually for parts of the second movie, we shot that at the Methodist Church at the corner of Franklin and Highland in Hollywood. They have a gymnasium there, and that was the location that we used. But they didn't have any of that catwalk stuff that we used later. So we had to build the actual stage on stage 12 at Universal to do all that stuff with Michael up in the rigging and that gag. The wide stuff and the big dance stuff, we went back and shot in the same Methodist church, and we went back to Whittier High School and we shot all the exterior stuff right there at Whittier High School again. And we actually built the set of Strickland's office, as I remember, as sort of a freestanding set that we were able to move around at Whittier to get the angle so that you could look out the window and see George deck Biff.
In regards to the scenes that take place in 1955, did you use any kind of optical trickery to recreate what had been done in Back to the Future 1, or did you reshoot everything from scratch?
There's some outtakes from Back to the Future 1 of Crispin in Back to the Future 2, and then we also recreated shots with Jeffrey Weissman, who played George McFly in the sequels. And Bob always tried to figure out a way to make sure that you were looking at his back, or to just throw the focus out a little bit so you wouldn't realize that it wasn't Crispin.
To answer your question specifically, the only opticals were only ever optical splits where we put the two characters in. Everything that was in the frame was physical and built and recreated to match the first movie.
One question here has to do with the Pepsi commercial that aired around the time of Back to the Future Part 2.
The Pepsi commercial that you're talking about was filmed while we were shooting Back to the Future Part 3, because I remember getting really pissed off at Michael's agent for telling me that Michael was going to leave Back to the Future 3 for 3 days to shoot these Pepsi commercials, leaving the company with no Michael J. Fox to shoot with. But that happened while we were shooting Part 3.
I think, Bob Z, one day you told me that you came up with all those jokes because you didn't really want to have to deal with the technology of the future. And that's how the Jaws Steven Spielberg joke came about. Is that correct? And if you can elaborate a little bit about that.
You know, we always did a theater marquee gag, and we did two of them in the first movie. You know, in the first movie, the Essex Theater is playing this Ronald Reagan movie. And then in 1985, it's a porno theater. So we thought then in the future it should be a hologram theater. And then we said, well, what should it be? And we said, oh, well, Jaws 10, because, you know, Jaws 19 or whatever it was that we were saying, because, you know, let's make some sequel jokes, because we're doing a sequel.
Well, was it tough to come up with some of the, as I said, you know, the gadgets of the future, or were you trying to make them look practical, or?
We wanted to make all the gadgetry in the future look fun more than practical. Well, there was a certain amount of practicality we thought about, but the guy that designed most of that is a fellow named John Bell, who was one of the designers at ILM, and he joined the art department for this because he just had such a wacky imagination. And I remember Bob would tell John, he said, just give me some stuff that we don't even know what the hell it is. Just some stuff we can put on the street that nobody will know what it is, and it'll just be there. And we've got some really interesting signs in the town square, some picture signs of things with a circle and a slash through it that I couldn't tell you what they're supposed to mean. John just came up with these crazy images.
We would have these endless future meetings about the future. I mean, we would have them over and over. We would bring the wardrobe department in, Rick Carter's department, and the prop design, and we would just try to figure out.
We'd come up with ideas like, we'd say, okay, if cars can fly, what are the kind of problems that are going to result from that? At one point we thought, well, if cars are leaking oil and they're flying, everybody would be carrying an umbrella because they'd be getting oil on their clothes from oil falling out of the sky, which was a great gag, but it took too long to explain it, so we didn't use it.
I thought one of the neat things we came up with is the two-tie thing. You know, like the two knotted ties.
We had a tie joke in the first movie because Christopher Lloyd's tie at the end and at the beginning of this is clear plastic. So he's wearing a tie that you can't even see. So then we said, well, what's the other tie joke we can do? And
then I think it was actually in the script, and you see it in the movie, but you really can't see, is that kids all wear their pants inside out. Doc say that?
Yeah, he says it.
Yeah. But it's hard to tell because they're denim jeans. We did stuff like that. You know, we tried our best, but it's hard.
Incidentally, one of the little kids playing the video game in the Cafe 80s is Elijah Wood, who you all know now from Lord of the Rings, and I think that was actually his first movie appearance.
Tell us about product placement in Back to the Future Part 2.
Well, which is the one, my favorite story is, which was the one about the Versateller? Was that in the sequel?
Actually, that was in Back to the Future 1.
Oh, that was
actually.
in Back to the Future 1. So yeah.
Should I tell the story, Laurent?
Go ahead.
Edit it out. The product placement guy that I told you about last time, who was just trying to promote every sleazy deal that he could, we said, let's have we had a Bank of America there, let's have a Versateller. And Bank of America thought that meant that we wanted an actual working Versateller. And they actually brought this truck with this working Versateller and these technicians, and they were going to install this real Versateller.
Put phone lines in.
All this stuff.
You know.
It was just ridiculous. We told them, no, it doesn't have to work. They couldn't understand, why would you want one that didn't work?
Yeah, they couldn't grasp the concept of stuff being fake. You know, they just couldn't get it.
one of the product placement issues that we had in part 2, it was not just a placement, but it was a promotion. The studio made this deal with Pizza Hut. And when Back to the Future 2 came out, Pizza Hut was going to do a promotion, and every week you were going to get futuristic glasses from Back to the Future Part 2. And the studio loves to make these deals with the fast food companies because they have such a huge advertising budget, and it still goes on. You'll see a commercial for the fast food, but they'll have footage from the movie, so it's like a free TV spot for the movie. But the deal with the devil that you make when you do this stuff is that the fast food companies have to have this really long lead time. They can't change their release dates as quickly as we change our release dates in the movie business. So there was a point where we got a phone call from the product placement and promotion people at Universal saying, if this Pizza Hut deal is going to go, you now have 24 hours to get out of it. In other words, if you're not going to make a Thanksgiving release for 1989, tell us now and we can still blow this deal. But if you say that you're going to make it, come hell or high water, the movie's coming out Thanksgiving 1989, because otherwise Pizza Hut will sue our ass off because they'll have spent all this money to develop these products that they're going to promote with the pizza.
Sometimes it was fun though, because talking about the pizzas reminded me when we were doing that scene where she hydrates the little pizza and it becomes a big pizza. Pizza Hut brought an entire kitchen onto the stage, you know, with refrigerators and ovens and 3 pizza
food stylists.
This stuff just arrived and they plugged it on. They brought all their own pepperoni. They worked for, you know, hours and hours and hours designing these pizzas, which was so nice to have like this elaborate thing happening there. And of course, all the reject pizzas they would just give to the crew to eat. So that was kind of fun. They just brought all these people in. It was one less thing for me to do. Tell me when you got a pizza that's ready to shoot. Yeah.
In talking about making those 2 movies together, we talked about, you know, how hard it was on you guys from the behind the camera. Tell us about how hard it was in front of the camera dealing with the actors, especially Michael, with virtually almost every shot, if not like several times in the same shot. Tell us about working with them, and especially Michael, and how you got the performances you got from him.
You know, there really was no problem. I mean, Michael...
For the first 3 months, remember, he was still doing Family Ties.
Well, that was a problem. But that was because, yeah, the first 3 months we were still back at night shooting. I remember just being on those stages shooting at night. But as far as shooting the splits, I mean, Michael understood the concept and he knew what he needed to do.
It was tough for the actors just spending the hours and hours that they had to spend in makeup. That was a killer. If we were shooting in the daytime, I know Tom Wilson, getting that old age makeup, he would get to the set like at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he'd work 18 hours.
The hardest thing, I remember they would all complain about this, and it happened mostly to Leah because she obviously had the most sensitive skin, but what happens is that you have those prosthetics on your face all day, and when you wrap, what you want to do is just get that stuff off. And they say, no, don't do that, don't do that. So you have to go back into the chair for at least an hour where they take a solvent and they paint it off of you so you don't irritate your face, because if you pull that stuff off and then you irritate your skin, then you're in agony the next day when they start putting the glue back on. And we had a couple of situations where that happened. So it's like not only are they in hours of makeup in the morning, they're in hours of makeup at night, and everybody's got to have their turnaround, and you know, it's just a lot of work.
It's of course really fun to see Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers playing the role of Needles. How did he get the part?
He came in red, you know, the casting director, and we said he's perfect. But I know, it is cool that he's become this guy, like he plays bass on all these other guys' albums and stuff. Yeah, it's cool.
And Charles Fleischer, of course, makes a cameo appearance. How did he end up in the movie?
Well, because I had spent, you know, a year working with Charles on Roger Rabbit, so...
Charlie just wanted to be on camera as himself once instead of just being this cartoon voice.
Yeah, right. Can I just be on camera instead of just a voice, you know? That's how he got in the movie.
Okay, everybody, I think we're gonna stop right here and save the rest of your great questions for the Back to the Future Part 3 session. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for listening. And the biggest thank you, of course, to Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale.